Welcome to Narrative Nights, where secrets, whispers, and tales waiting to be told. Don't forget to subscribe the channel, like this video, and share it to fellow mystery lovers. Let's get started. Chapter 1. The Ominous Call. The dim, amber glow of the lamp barely penetrated the shadows that clung to the corners of Chloe's small apartment. It was late, the city outside a distant hum, and the silence within her walls was usually a comforting companion. Tonight, however, the silence felt heavy, pregnant with an unseen threat. Chloe, curled on her worn armchair, was immersed in a classic slasher film, the flickering images on the screen a familiar comfort. She knew every trope, every jump scare, every predictable twist. Horror movies were her passion, her escape, her study. Then the phone rang. The shrill, invasive sound sliced through the quiet, a jarring intrusion that sent a jolt of adrenaline through her veins. She glanced at the screen. Unknown number. A flicker of unease danced in her stomach. She rarely received calls at this hour, and the anonymity of the caller filled her with a sudden, inexplicable dread. Hesitantly, she answered.
"Hello?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. A distorted voice, raspy and chilling, echoed through the receiver. "Chloe," it rasped, the name of venomous caress. "Ready for your close-up?" A cold shiver ran down her spine. The voice was unnatural, processed, yet it carried a disturbing familiarity, a sinister undertone that made her skin crawl. "Who is this?" she demanded, her voice trembling despite her attempts at bravado. "Your director," the voice hissed, the word dripping with a mocking formality. "And tonight you're starring in a real-life slasher. You know the rules, don't you, Chloe? Or should I say, the tropes?" The mention of tropes sent a wave of icy terror through her. It was a word she used frequently, a term of endearment for the predictable patterns of her beloved horror genre. But this wasn't playful banter. This was a threat. "What are you talking about?" she stammered, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The voice chuckled, a low, guttural sound that sent a shiver down her spine. The final girl, the isolated location, the escalating body count, all the classics, Chloe, and you, my dear, are the star of the show. He began to list them off. The phone call that starts it all, the masked killer with a penchant for monologues, the seemingly safe haven that turns into a death trap. Each trope he listed, each detail he mentioned, was a chilling reminder of the very films she loved. But now they were being weaponized against her. "You're insane," she whispered, her voice choked with fear. "Insane?" the voice echoed, a hint of amusement in its distorted tone. "Or just a devoted fan, a connoisseur of the genre? After all, Chloe, you know these stories better than anyone. You've dissected them, analyzed them, memorized them. Now it's time to experience them." He paused, a pregnant silence hanging heavy in the air. "Don't worry, Chloe," he continued, his voice dripping with a sinister sweetness. "I'll make sure it's a performance you'll never forget. A true masterpiece of terror." The line went dead. Chloe slammed the phone down, her hand shaking so violently that she nearly dropped it. Her eyes were wide with terror, her breath coming in ragged gasps. This wasn't a prank. This was Ghostface, and he was playing for keeps. She looked around her apartment, once a sanctuary, now a potential death trap. The shadows seemed to deepen, the familiar furniture morphing into menacing shapes. The flickering images on the television screen, once a source of comfort, now seemed to mock her, a constant reminder of the horror about to unfold. The specific horror tropes mentioned in the call echoed in her mind. The final girl, the isolated location, the escalating body count. They were all classic elements of slasher films, but they also hinted at something more, something specific. They hinted at a meticulous plan, a carefully crafted script, a twisted obsession with recreating the very films she loved. And as the night deepened and the silence returned, Chloe knew one thing for certain. Her life was about to become a real-life horror movie, and she was the star. The director was calling the shots, and the show was about to begin. She remembered the way he said connoisseur of the genre. It was as if he was talking about someone that had spent their life studying such movies. A person that had a deep, dark obsession. A person like Mrs. Henderson.
Chapter 2. The Staged Scenes. The morning after the chilling phone call dawned with a grim, overcast sky, mirroring the oppressive dread that had settled over Chloe. News reports blared from every screen, each headline a stark testament to the killer's escalating violence. The first victim, a local college student named Sarah, had been found in her apartment, her death eerily reminiscent of a scene from Halloween. The second, a young man named Mark, was discovered in a secluded park, his demise a chilling recreation of a kill from Friday the 13th. Chloe, her eyes glued to the television screen, felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. Each death was a macabre tribute, a meticulous reproduction of iconic slasher scenes. The killer wasn't just killing, he was directing a twisted homage, a real-life horror film with her as the unwilling star. The pattern was unmistakable. Sarah's death, staged with a kitchen knife in a darkened hallway, was a clear nod to Michael Myers' signature style. Mark's demise, involving a machete and a secluded woodland setting, was a chilling echo of Jason Voorhees' brutal methods. The victims weren't random. They were carefully selected, their deaths meticulously planned to fit the killer's twisted vision. Chloe, with her encyclopedic knowledge of horror films, recognized the sequence. It wasn't just random acts of violence. It was a carefully curated narrative, a pre-planned script. The victims' deaths followed a specific order, mirroring famous slasher sequences, suggesting a meticulous and pre-planned script. The escalating violence amplified her fear. Each new report, each new gruesome detail, reinforced the danger she was in. The killer was methodical, precise, and utterly ruthless. He wasn't just playing games, he was creating a masterpiece of terror, and she was trapped in his twisted vision. Liam, her perpetually anxious best friend, called, his voice trembling with fear. "Chloe, have you seen the news?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. It's like a movie." "I know," Chloe replied, her voice hoarse. "He's recreating classic slasher scenes. It's not random. It's a pattern." "A pattern?" Liam echoed, his voice filled with dread. "What does it mean?" "It means he's following a script," Chloe said, her mind racing. "He's not just killing, he's directing." "He's creating a story, and we're all playing our parts." They began to analyze the killer's methods, trying to predict his next move. They reviewed the news reports, meticulously dissecting each death, searching for clues, for any hint of the killer's identity. They realized that everyone they knew could be a target, and no place was safe. The fear was palpable, a suffocating blanket that smothered any sense of security. Chloe felt a growing sense of paranoia, a constant feeling that she was being watched, that the killer was always one step ahead. She looked through her window and saw the diner across the street. Mrs. Henderson was cleaning the windows and waved at Chloe. Chloe felt a shiver, an uncomfortable feeling, but waved back. The killer's meticulous planning hinted at a deep-seated obsession, a twisted desire to control every aspect of his macabre creation. He wasn't just a murderer, he was a director, a storyteller, a puppet master, pulling the strings of his victims' lives. The order of the victims' deaths was not random. It was as if he was telling a story, a story that only someone who knew the genre intimately could understand. A person like Mrs. Henderson, a person who had spent her life serving people, observing their habits, their fears, a person who knew how to create a perfect scene, a perfect death, a person who had the perfect cover. As the day wore on, the fear intensified, the tension mounting with each new report. Chloe knew that she couldn't just sit and wait. She had to act, to find the killer before he found her. She had to stop his twisted masterpiece before it reached its final, horrifying act. Chapter 3. The Double D Trap. The storm arrived with a ferocity that seemed almost theatrical, a dramatic crescendo to the already mounting terror. The sky, a bruised and ominous grey, unleashed a torrential downpour, the rain lashing against the city streets like a relentless, angry beast. The wind howled, a mournful cry that echoed through the deserted avenues, rattling windows and sending debris swirling through the air. Chloe, her nerves frayed and her senses heightened, found herself trapped in the Double D Diner, a classic, retro-style eatery that usually served as a beacon of warmth and comfort. Tonight, however, the diner was a prison, an isolated haven turned into a potential death trap. Liam, his face pale and his hands trembling, sat opposite her, his eyes darting nervously around the dimly lit space. The sudden blackout had plunged the city into darkness, leaving only the flickering emergency lights of the diner to illuminate the scene. The rain hammered against the windows, creating a constant, rhythmic drumming that amplified the silence within. The once welcoming atmosphere of the diner had been replaced by a palpable sense of dread, the warm, inviting glow of the neon signs now casting long, distorted shadows that danced and writhed in the darkness. "This is just like a movie," Liam whispered, his voice barely audible above the howling wind. "We're trapped, isolated, at the mercy of him." Chloe nodded, her gaze fixed on the rain-streaked windows. The diner, with its checkered floors, red vinyl booths and chrome counter, was a classic horror setting, a perfect stage for the killer's twisted performance. The isolation, the darkness, the storm. It was all too familiar, too reminiscent of the very films they were trying to escape. "He wants us here," Chloe said, her voice low and tense. "He's orchestrating this, he's setting the scene." The shadows in the diner seemed to deepen, stretching and twisting into menacing shapes. The familiar comfort of the booths and tables was replaced by a sense of claustrophobia, a feeling of being trapped in a confined space with an unseen predator. The air was thick with tension, a suffocating blanket of fear that pressed down on them, making it hard to breathe. The silence was broken by a blood-curdling scream, a piercing cry that echoed from the back of the diner. It was a scream of pure terror, a sound that sent a jolt of adrenaline through Chloe and Liam. The scream abruptly cut off. "He's here," Liam whispered, his voice choked with fear. "He's inside." The emergency lights flickered and died, plunging the diner into absolute darkness. The only light came from the occasional flashes of lightning outside, illuminating the rain-soaked windows and casting fleeting, ghostly shadows across the interior. The silence that followed the scream was even more terrifying, a pregnant stillness that amplified the fear. Chloe's heart pounded in her chest, her senses on high alert. She strained her ears, listening for any sound, any indication of the killer's presence. The silence was broken only by the relentless drumming of the rain and the howling wind, a constant, ominous backdrop to the unfolding horror. She knew they couldn't stay in the open. They needed to find a place to hide, a place to regroup, to plan their next move. But where? The diner was a maze of booths, tables, and kitchen equipment, each potential hiding spot also a potential trap. The scream, though brief, had confirmed their worst fears. Ghostface was here, in the darkness, stalking them like prey. The diner, once a symbol of warmth and safety, was now a battleground, a stage for the killer's final act. The sudden darkness was a message, a very loud and very clear message. Run. Chapter 4. The Ghost in the Shadows. The darkness was a suffocating blanket, a void that amplified the fear and distorted every sound. Chloe's eyes strained, trying to pierce the inky blackness, but the only illumination came from the occasional flashes of lightning that momentarily painted the diner in stark, ghostly hues. Each flash revealed a chaotic scene, overturned tables, scattered chairs, and terrified patrons huddled in corners, their faces etched with fear. Then a figure emerged from the shadows. Ghostface, his iconic mask, a stark white against the darkness, moved with a chilling grace, a predator stalking its prey. His movements were fluid, almost ethereal, a stark contrast to the chaotic panic that gripped the diner. He held his knife, its blade glinting menacingly in the faint light, a silent promise of violence. "Welcome to the final act," Ghostface announced, his voice a distorted, menacing growl that echoed through the darkness. "Tonight, we're playing a little game called Survival of the Fittest." His words were a chilling declaration, a promise of a deadly game where only the strongest or the luckiest would survive. The announcement sent a wave of panic through the remaining patrons, their screams and cries adding to the already chaotic atmosphere. Chloe's mind raced, trying to strategize, to find a way to escape the killer's grasp. But the darkness and the sheer terror of the situation made it nearly impossible to think clearly. She knew she had to stay calm, to focus, to use her knowledge of horror tropes to her advantage. The chaos among the patrons was both a distraction and a danger. People scrambled for cover, bumping into tables and chairs, their panicked movements creating a cacophony of noise. Chloe knew that Ghostface would use this chaos to his advantage, picking off his victims one by one, like a hunter selecting the weakest members of the herd. She tried to assess the situation, to identify potential escape routes, but the darkness made it impossible to see anything clearly. She knew that Ghostface was watching them, observing their movements, anticipating their next move. He was playing a game, and he was enjoying every minute of it. The darkness was a constant obstacle, a suffocating presence that hampered her every move. She couldn't see where she was going, she couldn't see where Ghostface was, and she couldn't see who was still alive. Every sound, every shadow was a potential threat. Chloe knew that she had to act quickly to find a way to turn the tables on the killer. But how? She was trapped, hunted, and the killer was closing in. She remembered the trope of the killer isolating victims. She knew she had to stay near others, but it was hard to know who was still able to move. She felt a hand grab her arm and jumped. It was Liam. He was shaking, his eyes wide with fear. "We have to get out of here," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I know," Chloe replied, her voice barely audible. "But where?" "It's too dark to see anything." They moved cautiously, their hands outstretched, feeling their way through the darkness. They stumbled over overturned chairs and tables, their movements clumsy and slow. They could hear the panicked breathing of other patrons, the occasional whimper, the rustling of clothes as people tried to hide. Suddenly a scream pierced the darkness, followed by a sickening thud. Ghostface had struck again. The scream sent a jolt of terror through Chloe and Liam, reminding them of the killer's relentless pursuit. Chloe knew that they couldn't stay hidden forever. They had to find a way to fight back, to confront the killer, to end this nightmare. But how could they fight an enemy they couldn't see? How could they survive a game where the rules were constantly changing? The darkness was his ally, and it was her greatest enemy. Chapter 5. The counter-offensive. The metallic tang of fear mixed with the sugary scent of spilled syrups filled the air. Chloe, her adrenaline surging, knew she couldn't remain a passive victim. The darkness was Ghostface's weapon, but she would turn it against him. Her mind, a library of horror tropes, scanned the diner's environment, searching for anything she could weaponize. She gripped the heavy sugar dispenser on a nearby table, its weight reassuring in her trembling hands. It wasn't much, but it was something. As Ghostface's distorted voice echoed through the darkness, taunting his prey, Chloe moved silently, her footsteps muffled by the scattered debris. Ghostface emerged from the shadows, his knife glinting in the faint light filtering through the rain-streaked windows. He was stalking a lone figure, a young woman huddled beneath a booth. Chloe saw her chance. With a surge of adrenaline, she hurled the sugar dispenser, aiming for Ghostface's head. The dispenser connected with a resounding thud, the impact momentarily stunning the killer. He stumbled back, his distorted voice erupting in a guttural growl. "You think sugar will stop me?" he snarled, his voice laced with rage. "You're playing a dangerous game, Chloe!" He lunged, his knife flashing in the darkness. Chloe ducked, narrowly avoiding the blow. She scrambled behind the counter, her eyes searching for another weapon. The sizzling hot plate, still radiating heat from the kitchen, caught her attention. She grabbed it, the heat searing her skin, but she ignored the pain. Ghostface was closing in, his footsteps echoing through the diner. Chloe turned, the hot plate raised, and slammed it into his masked face. He roared in pain, his masked face contorted in a silent scream. The sizzling sound of the hot plate against his mask filled the air. The brief advantage was hers, but she knew it wouldn't last. Ghostface's rage was palpable, his determination to kill her unwavering. She needed to create more distance, more time. "Liam," she whispered, her voice urgent. "You need to hide." Liam, his eyes wide with fear, hesitated. "But what about you?" "He's isolating us," Chloe said, her voice firm. "That's how he wins. Go, hide in the freezer. It's cold, but it's the safest place." Liam nodded, his fear overriding his hesitation. He disappeared into the kitchen, the heavy door slamming shut behind him. Chloe was alone. Ghostface, his rage intensified, stalked towards her, his knife dripping with blood. "You can't hide forever, Chloe," he taunted. "Your final scene is about to begin." Chloe's gaze darted around the diner, searching for an escape route, a weapon, anything. That's when she saw it. Ghostface was approaching Mrs. Henderson, the seemingly harmless diner owner who was cowering behind a booth. But something was off. Ghostface's movements were different, almost tender. He knelt beside Mrs. Henderson, his voice dropping to a low murmur. "You know, Mrs. Henderson," he said, his voice laced with a disturbing affection, "you've always been my favorite audience." His words were a stark contrast to his earlier brutality, a chilling hint of a deeper connection between them. It was as if he was performing for her, showing her his masterpiece. It was as if she was a part of the show. The moment of tenderness was brief. Ghostface raised his knife, his movements becoming swift and deadly. But Chloe had seen enough. She lunged, tackling him from behind, sending them both crashing to the floor. The mask flew off, revealing Mrs. Henderson's face, her eyes blazing with a fanatical intensity. The realization hit Chloe like a physical blow. The sweet old lady who served the best apple pie in town was the killer. "You ruined my masterpiece!" Mrs. Henderson shrieked, her voice a twisted echo of her usual sweet demeanor. "I was recreating the perfect slasher, every kill a work of art!" Chloe wrestled the knife away from her, her mind reeling. The clue was there. The tenderness, the words, the staging. Mrs. Henderson wasn't just a killer. She was a director, an artist, a twisted connoisseur of horror. and she was obsessed with creating her own final scene. Chapter 6. The Unmasking and Revelation. The diner floor became a chaotic battleground, a tangle of limbs and desperation. Chloe, her adrenaline surging, grappled with Mrs. Henderson, the revelation of her identity sending a shockwave through her system. The sweet, unassuming diner owner, the purveyor of comfort food and warm smiles, was a deranged killer, her eyes blazing with a fanatical intensity that sent chills down Chloe's spine. "You're insane!" Chloe screamed, her voice hoarse, wrestling the knife away from Mrs. Henderson's grasp. "You killed people! They were just extras!" Mrs. Henderson shrieked, her voice a twisted echo of her usual sweet demeanor. "Sacrifices to the genre. I was recreating the perfect slasher, a symphony of terror." Her words were a chilling confession, a testament to her twisted obsession with horror films. She wasn't just killing, she was directing, staging, creating her own macabre masterpiece. Each victim was a prop, each death a scene in her twisted film. The fight escalated, Mrs. Henderson's strength fueled by her madness. She lunged, her eyes filled with a terrifying determination, her face contorted in a mask of rage. "I am the director," she shrieked, her voice echoing through the diner, "and this is my final scene." Chloe, her mind racing, tried to anticipate Mrs. Henderson's moves, using her knowledge of horror tropes to her advantage. She knew that the killer often revealed their motives in a final, dramatic monologue, a moment of twisted triumph before the final kill. "Why?" Chloe demanded, her voice trembling but firm. "Why are you doing this?" "Because it's art," Mrs. Henderson hissed, her voice laced with a fanatical zeal. "Because it's beautiful. Don't you see, Chloe? I'm elevating the genre, bringing it to its true potential. I'm creating a masterpiece." Her words were a chilling testament to her delusion. She saw herself as an artist, a visionary, her victims mere tools in her creative process. The diner, with its retro decor and isolated location, was her stage, her canvas, her film set. "You're a monster," Chloe said, her voice filled with disgust. "You're not creating art. You're destroying lives." "Lives?" Mrs. Henderson scoffed, her voice dripping with contempt. "They're just characters, Chloe. They're playing their parts, and their parts are to die." The revelation of Mrs. Henderson's identity and motives sent a wave of nausea through Chloe. The seemingly harmless diner owner, the woman who had always been so kind and welcoming, was a cold-blooded killer, her mind twisted by a dark obsession. The fight continued, a brutal struggle for survival. Chloe, her body aching, her mind reeling, knew she had to stop Mrs. Henderson. She couldn't let her continue her twisted game, her macabre masterpiece. She remembered the strange, almost tender interaction between Ghostface and Mrs. Henderson. It wasn't just a random encounter, it was a connection, a shared passion for the horror genre. Mrs. Henderson wasn't just playing a part, she was the mastermind, the director, the driving force behind the killings. The realization was chilling. Mrs. Henderson wasn't just a killer, she was a fan, a connoisseur, a devotee of the very films Chloe loved. But her love was twisted, corrupted, a dark reflection of Chloe's own fascination with the genre. Chloe knew that she had to expose Mrs. Henderson's true nature, to reveal the monster beneath the mask of normalcy. She had to show the world the true face of the seemingly harmless diner owner, the woman who had turned her love of horror into a deadly obsession. The fight reached a fever pitch, Mrs. Henderson's rage and madness fueling her every move. The kitchen knives, once tools for cooking, became tools for murder. The sweet old woman had a dark side that was now in full display. Chapter 7. The Director's Final Scene. The air in the Double D diner crackled with a tension that surpassed even the most dramatic cinematic climax. Mrs. Henderson, her eyes gleaming with a fanatical light, saw herself not as a murderer, but as a visionary, a director crafting her magnum opus. The diner, a stage set, and Chloe, the unwilling star of her final scene. "This is it, Chloe," Mrs. Henderson hissed, her voice a chilling whisper. "The grand finale, the moment of truth." She lunged, the kitchen knife a gleaming extension of her twisted intent. Chloe, her body bruised and battered, her mind racing, dodged the blow, the blade narrowly missing her. She knew that Mrs. Henderson was operating under a delusion, her reality warped by her obsession. She wasn't just trying to kill her, she was trying to create a perfect scene, a dramatic climax worthy of her twisted vision. "You're not a director," Chloe retorted, her voice strained. "You're a killer." "I am an artist," Mrs. Henderson shrieked, her voice echoing through the diner. "And this is my masterpiece. This is my legacy." She moved with a surprising agility, her movements fueled by a manic energy. She was determined to deliver a final, dramatic kill, a moment of theatrical violence that would cement her place in the annals of horror. "Every death, a carefully crafted scene," she continued, her voice laced with a disturbing pride. "Every victim, a perfect prop. And you, Chloe, you're the star, the final girl, the one who must face the ultimate terror." She stalked Chloe, her knife raised, her eyes fixed on her prey. "This is your close-up, Chloe," she whispered, her voice dripping with a macabre sweetness. "Time for your final scene." Chloe knew that she couldn't reason with Mrs. Henderson. She was lost in her delusion, her mind consumed by her obsession. She had to find a way to stop her, to end this nightmare. She remembered the trope of the final girl, the resourceful heroine who used her wits and courage to overcome the killer. She had to channel that inner strength, to find a way to survive. Mrs. Henderson lunged, her knife aimed at Chloe's heart. Chloe ducked, the blade slicing through the air. She grabbed a nearby stool, using it as a makeshift shield, deflecting Mrs. Henderson's attacks. "This isn't a movie!" Chloe yelled, her voice filled with a desperate determination. "This is real life!" "Real life is boring," Mrs. Henderson retorted, her voice laced with contempt. "This is art. This is drama. This is perfection." Just as Mrs. Henderson was about to deliver the final blow, a loud bang echoed through the diner. A gunshot. Mrs. Henderson froze, her eyes widening in surprise. She turned, her gaze fixed on the doorway. A police officer stood there, his gun still smoking, his face grim. "Drop the knife," the officer commanded, his voice firm and unwavering. Mrs. Henderson, her eyes filled with a terrifying rage, turned back to Chloe, her face contorted in a mask of pure madness. "You ruined it!" she shrieked, her voice a raw, animalistic cry. "You ruined my masterpiece!" She lunged, her knife raised, her movements desperate and erratic. The officer fired again, and Mrs. Henderson collapsed, her reign of terror finally over. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of the rain pounding against the windows. Chloe, her body trembling, her mind reeling, stared at Mrs. Henderson's lifeless body, her eyes filled with a mixture of shock and disbelief. Liam emerged from the freezer, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. He rushed to Chloe's side, his hands shaking as he touched her arm. "Are you okay?" he whispered, his voice hoarse. Chloe nodded, her voice choked with emotion. "Yeah," she said, her voice barely audible. "I think so." The police officer approached, his face grim. "It's over," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "She's gone." The aftermath was a blur of police officers, paramedics, and flashing lights. Chloe and Liam, still shaken and confused, were questioned, their accounts of the night's events, a surreal and terrifying tale. The diner, once a place of warmth and comfort, was now a crime scene, a stark reminder of the night's horrors. The rain continued to fall, washing away the blood, but not the memories. The final scene was over, but the credits were still rolling. Chapter 8. The Aftermath and the Final Cut. The flashing blue and red lights of the police cruisers painted the rain-slicked asphalt with an eerie, surreal glow. Inside the Double D diner, the air hung heavy with the metallic scent of blood and the lingering tension of terror. Chloe, wrapped in a thermal blanket, sat amidst the chaos, her gaze fixed on the scene unfolding before her. The diner, once a beacon of warmth and comfort, was now a macabre tableau, a testament to the night's horrors. Yellow crime scene tape cordoned off areas, and forensic technicians meticulously documented the scene, their movements precise and methodical. Liam, his face pale and drawn, sat beside her, his silence a reflection of the shared trauma. "It's over," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "It's finally over." Chloe nodded, her gaze drifting to the covered body of Mrs. Henderson. The seemingly harmless diner owner, the woman who had served countless cups of coffee and slices of apple pie, was revealed to be a twisted killer, her mind consumed by a dark obsession. "Yeah," Chloe said, her voice barely a whisper. "Over. But was it really?" She looked around the diner, her mind replaying the night's events like a twisted film reel. The phone calls, the stalking, the brutal murders, all meticulously crafted to mimic the classic horror tropes she knew so well. Yet the reality had been far more terrifying, far more visceral than any movie. She thought of Mrs. Henderson, her face contorted in a mask of madness as she revealed her twisted obsession. The revelation had been a shock, a jarring twist that even her horror-savvy mind hadn't anticipated. "You know," she said, her voice gaining a hint of her usual wryness, "I always thought the killer would be some brooding loner, some internet-obsessed fanatic. But Mrs. Henderson, the sweet old lady who made the best pie in town, that's a plot twist even I didn't see coming." She stood up, her legs still shaky, and walked towards the counter, where a single, flickering fluorescent light cast long, distorted shadows. She looked at the security camera mounted above the register, its lens a silent observer of the night's events. "It's like a meta-slasher," she mused, her voice echoing in the empty diner. "A killer who's obsessed with the genre but also completely oblivious to its inherent absurdity. It's like she was trying to direct her own movie, but she forgot that real life doesn't always follow the script." She paused, her gaze fixed on the camera lens. "And that's the thing about horror, isn't it?" she said, her voice laced with a strange mix of fear and fascination. "It's always playing with our expectations, always trying to subvert our assumptions. But sometimes the most terrifying thing is the mundane, the ordinary, the person you least suspect." She looked directly into the camera, her expression a mix of wry amusement and lingering fear. "That's horror for you. Always keeping you guessing, even when it's utterly absurd. And that's the real thrill, isn't it? The delicious, terrifying uncertainty of it all." She paused, a slow smile spreading across her face, as if she had just thought of something. Or maybe it was all just a bad recipe. She then looked at the camera with a knowing look, a chilling glint in her eyes. "You should have paid more attention to the pie." The final line hung in the air, a chilling implication that sent a shiver down the spine. The pie Mrs. Henderson served was, in fact, made of the victims, and that was her final and most twisted trope. The realization was a macabre twist, a dark secret hidden beneath the veneer of normalcy. The camera, a silent witness to the night's horrors, cut to black, leaving a chilling sense of unease and a dark, final clue. The story was over, but the lingering fear remained, a testament to the unpredictable nature of horror, both on screen and in real life.